Welcome to the channel. There's been a lot of talk recently about brightness on handheld screens, particularly because the Odin 2 Mini is coming out with supposedly one of the brightest screens we've ever seen on one of these emulation handhelds. So I thought, just so we could have some frame of reference, that we would look and see how bright these handheld screens actually are. So I have a light meter here, and I have, as you can see, a bunch of handhelds. And what I figured we would do is test out these screens and see what kind of brightness we get, just because when you look at a screen on the camera, it is very hard to tell exactly how bright it is, particularly, even if you're directly comparing two screens, because the camera tends to try to adjust the picture so it looks better, and the end result is you can't really see on these handheld reviews when we're comparing one device to another whether a screen is brighter, clearer, more colorful or not, because the camera is kind of working against us here. So at least for brightness, I figured maybe we could do something somewhat objective here and try to measure the brightness of the screens. Some manufacturers report brightness of handhelds. A lot of them don't, though. So there's no way to know before you actually grab one of these things, oh, how bright's the screen going to be? Can I use it outside? And things like that. So I figured we would play around with this light meter and see if we could get some numbers. So let's talk methodology. The proper way to do a test like this of screen brightness would be with something called a luminance meter. But if you've ever looked up a luminance meter and tried to price one, well, let's just say it's a little bit beyond the price range of this channel. So you can talk of spending a couple $100 to $1,000 on one of these things, and, well, just to be frank, we don't have the budget for that. So what I could pick up was an illuminance meter. Basically, the difference is a luminance meter measures the light coming out of something, and an illuminance meter essentially measures the light received on the sensor. But essentially, though, we have a device where the number goes up as the brightness that shines on the sensor goes up. So for much less money, we got one of these things, so I'm not going to try to talk about nits or anything. This meter measures in lux, and basically what we're going to use here as our working assumption is the brighter the screen, the bigger the number. So more lux is brighter here. Now, there is an issue here where we got a lot of devices. This is the ROG 28XX, and it's kind of tiny. And of course, the bigger the screen is, the more the overall light output's going to be. So we need some way to control for the size of the screen. So what I did was I got some black cardboard here, or black construction paper, and I cut approximately a 1-inch square hole in here, and I made some markings so that I could line up the hole the same way with each device, and for multiple measurements the same way each time. This you might recognize if you've looked at my channel a couple of times. This is the stand I use to put my handhelds up on so that they show up good on the camera, and this is my illuminance meter right here. The nice thing about this is I found out that the stand will basically almost allow the meter to be snapped in here. So it allows me to have a very regular positioning of the meter. Now, what I needed to do on each handheld was, just for consistency, I'm using a white screen to measure the brightness. So on each handheld I tested, I had to find some way to get it to display a plain white screen. For the ROG 28XX, I just made a video of essentially a pure white screen, and I saved it on here because the system actually has a video player. And what we're going to do is I'll just show you kind of how this works. Of course, I did all the testing for all these handhelds in a dark room, not underneath these bright lights that we have here for the video. But just to kind of show you how it works, there's a towel under here. The idea is to press the handheld up against the bottom of the stand, because the further away the screen is from the sensor, of course, the less bright it's going to appear. So, and this is to cover up all but a 1-inch square area. So what we're going to do here is we're going to try to get this towel folded to kind of get this handheld in exactly the right place. We'll slide. I'm a little off right now, so I'll kind of back it up. Again, this is not perfect, but it is at least somewhat reproducible here. So I've got this positioned with my little guidelines here. I've got my illuminance meter. I'm going to put it down on here. And of course, I'm getting a measurement now, which actually is pretty consistent with the one that I'll show you later. But like I said, I did this in a dark room because the lights may affect the results just a little bit. But you kind of get the idea. I position the screen underneath so that I get a 1-inch square white display screen here, and I essentially read off the measurement here. Again, we did this in the dark to prevent the lights that you see right now from interfering with the results, but you get the idea. So we try to place the sensor the same distance away from the screen each time, and we try to cover up enough of the screen so that we only get approximately a 1 square inch view of the screen. And as long as we do this consistently, at least I've noticed that the numbers on the scale correspond to the relative brightnesses that I see when I'm looking at these things in person. And of course, what you can't see when you're just looking at, well, how bright does the screen look on this camera? Because our cameras are going to try to correct for brightness and make the image look really good and all that. But that's not what we want. We want to know how bright the screen actually is. So that's a little bit about the methodology of the test here. Again, it's not perfect, but then again, we can't afford a luminance meter on this channel. So, and these numbers don't really seem to be out there for all these handhelds. So I figured, well, we'll do what we can here on the Chemical Burrito YouTube channel and try to get some measurements to talk about. Here we have the PlayStation Portable, the 3000 model. And this handheld here, this maximum brightness, doesn't have a super bright screen. Plus, we're maybe being a little unfair to the PlayStation Portable here because this handheld's old, it's been used a lot, and I suspect that the backlight brightness has gone dim over the past, what is it, like almost 20 years now. So, but this is a PSP 3000, which supposedly is the, quote, bright model, and measuring with the illuminance meter under our test conditions got a value of 90 lux, which is the lowest as of the first version of this video, of all the handhelds that I've tested. But again, the PSP was never known for a particularly bright screen. It really wasn't a handheld to play outside in the bright sun. But just kind of as a reference, the good old PSP 3000 gives us a value of about 90 lux. Here is the Nintendo DSi XL, which comes in actually a little bit brighter than a handheld like the PlayStation Portable, at least in my testing. Although, to be fair, I use the PlayStation Portable a lot more than I use my DS, so that may be affecting the results a bit. One thing I did notice, though, on these screens, and you can't tell by looking at it on the camera because, hey, this is what the camera does, but I did notice, and The numbers kind of back me up on this. The top screen of my DS is actually significantly dimmer than the lower screen. The lower screen is noticeably, and again, you probably can't see it on the camera, but it's noticeably brighter than the top screen is. And I don't know if that's true on every DS. I can only really test the ones that I have. But the upper screen clocks in at only 81 lux, but the lower screen is a more respectable 103. So this again is another pretty old handheld. So, and two things again. One, the device has probably gotten dimmer with time because it is quite old. And number two, back in the day, screens weren't as bright anyway. So we were kind of used to this. We thought this was like, a good brightness back then. These days, when we see a screen that's as dim as these old ones here, we think, oh, it's this terrible screen. It's awful. We need a better screen. But at the time, this is kind of what we had. This is the Vita 2000, the LCD model in its lovely neon orange color here. And the Vita 2000 had, you might say, a screen downgrade from the original Vita 1000, although you will not have to worry about burn-in on this regular old LCD screen. The brightness on this device clocks in at about 107 lux under our test conditions, which is brighter than some of the older devices like the PSP that we tested and the DSi XL. But as you'll see, and it's dimmed itself, as you'll see when we start comparing to some of the other devices, you'll see that the Vita 2000 is kind of on the lower end of the brightness scale, particularly when we're comparing to modern devices and not devices that are a decade old. Here's the original Vita. This is from the white Assassin's Creed bundle that they released shortly after, I think it was probably the second year of the Vita maybe. And this is, of course, the Vita 1000 with the OLED screen. And one thing, the OLED screen, at least in my testing, was brighter than the later LCD refresh. It's not all that different, particularly because my meter's not the best in the world. I wouldn't take a small difference in lux to be super meaningful, but it does appear that our original OLED Vita is a bit brighter than, dimmed itself again. It's a bit brighter than the LCD model, and of course it's brighter than the older generation handhelds like the DSi XL and the PSP models. So still it's not the brightest screen in the world anymore, but I still like the original Vita OLED screen. Imagine back in the day, this looked amazing. Now it's just, okay, it looks all right, but back when this thing first released, this was like the best screen you could get on a handheld. This is the RG28XX, also in lovely neon orange. And this is actually at 137 lux, this is the dimmest of the modern handhelds that I've tested for this video. And people, when this came out, they were complaining that the screen was a little too dim maybe. And I hear that the EU A30 is even dimmer than this one. This screen I'd classify as all right, kind of by modern standards, but it is noticeably dimmer than a lot of the other modern emulation handhelds and other handhelds. It just kind of goes to show you how far we've come when we're complaining about the dimness of this screen that's actually significantly brighter than a lot of the old handhelds back in the day, like the like the PSP and the DSi. So the RG28XX puts in a showing of 137 lux. This thing is huge. Here's a PC handheld, the Ally. I have the less expensive Z1 version. This handheld, by the way, except for the battery life, is really good for emulating classic games. So it's got plenty of punch to handle all the PS2 you can throw at it, for example. But in terms of screen brightness, now, of course, we only ended up measuring, and I had to use some extra paper here when I was measuring this one. We measured a brightness of 240 lux under the conditions of our testing. So as you can see, it's a good bit brighter than the RG28XX. It's a good bit brighter. It's like a lot brighter than the classic handhelds, your PSPs, your Vita, your DSi XL. So now, of course, overall, this thing's going to put out a lot more light than a lot of other handhelds just because it's so large. But per square inch, we got 240 lux, which is a kind of middle of the road modern brightness. But here is the PC handheld that we decided to throw into the mix. This is my current favorite, I think, emulation handheld. This is the Odin 2. And the Odin 2 is, if you want to do emulation of classic systems and you don't mind the fact that it's kind of large, this is probably the handheld you want to get because it has a Snapdragon 8 Generation 2 processor. It has plenty of RAM, and it can handle, well, pretty much anything that you could possibly throw at it on Android. So if you can only get one and you don't mind the fact that this is kind of large, now admittedly it's not as large as something like an Ally or Steam Deck, but it is kind of big. This is kind of the handheld to get right here. It just does everything, at least everything that can be done on Android. So as far as brightness goes, we get about 242 lux, which under the conditions of our tests is kind of middle of the road. It's pretty similar to a lot of other handhelds that are pretty new. It's not the brightest screen, it's not the dimmest, but it is nice and large, and it looks really good. So again, if you only can get one device that's currently out right now, the Odin 2 is an excellent choice. Yeah, this is probably my favorite of the current crop of handhelds. When I got my Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, one thing I noticed about it almost immediately was, wow, this screen is actually very, very bright. Now, compared to some of the other handhelds that I've tested, the screen does appear to be a little more washed out. Particularly the colors don't pop like they do on a handheld like the Odin 2, or certainly not any OLED-based device. So the colors are not the best in the world, but this handheld does bring the brightness. Now, I'm not sure how different the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro's screen is, but at least for the Retroid Pocket 3, under the conditions of our tests, it clocked in at 289 lux, which is actually a little brighter than handhelds like the Ally and the Odin 2. Of course, the screen's smaller, so overall, it doesn't quite emit as much light as one with a larger screen, but still, you got a pretty respectable brightness here. You can do a little bit of outdoor gaming on it, and the trade-off is the colors don't look quite as good as on a lot of the other handhelds, but if you want to light up the room, a Retroid Pocket 3 Plus will certainly fill that bill. Anbernic brought their A game when it comes to the screen on the ROG 556. When I first got this handheld and started it up, one of the things I noticed immediately was the OLED screen that they put in here is very, very bright. And when I tested under the conditions of our test here, I got a brightness of 337 lux, which is actually, as of at least the first version of this video, the brightest screen out of all the handhelds that I tested. So it's really hard to find fault with this screen. Anbernic did a really good job here. Some of the other parts of the handheld I wish were done a little bit better, like it could use a bit more horsepower, and of course people talk about the joysticks, but the screen is great. Probably, one of the best screens you can get without paying an obscene amount of money for a handheld. So ROG 556 clocks in at a very respectable 337 lux. You have a whole lot of brightness here. I don't think you have to worry about bright rooms. Direct sun, you may still have some issues, but under any kind of normal lighting conditions, this screen is going to look great. So we've tested a bunch of handhelds here. We've used our illuminance meter to try to get some numbers related to the brightness of these screens, and we've seen a bunch of results. So what have we learned here? Well, number one, you look at these three handhelds right here. Some of them are significantly brighter than the others, and if you just look at them on the screen right here, looked at it through the camera, it's actually kind of hard to tell. So that's why maybe having some numbers down will help you guys if you're looking to get a handheld and you're thinking about the brightness before you actually make a purchase. So let's look at some collected results, because it's always nice to have something on a table. So here is a table that shows all the results that I got, and I've kind of normalized them over here on the right as a percentage of PSP values. And of course, the PSP being the dimmest, most of these, well, almost the dimmest, except for the DSi upper screen. You'll see that most of these are significantly brighter than the good old-fashioned PSP 3000. Like the ROG 556 is 374% of the PSP's numbers, which just goes to show you the differences between older screen technology from almost 20 years ago and what we're kind of used to today. Although one other thing to take a look at would be take a look at the Vita OLED at 127 and the modern OLED in the ROG 556 at 337, which is a pretty significant jump there from the Vita 1000 to the ROG 556. OLEDs didn't used to be bright. They started off being pretty dim, and the Vita screen is actually a pretty good example of that. So we certainly see it here in this data that we've collected. Now, making everything as the percent of PSP makes all the numbers look really high. So we can also look at this as the percent of the brightest one I've tested so far, which is the ROG 556. And you can see that the modern handhelds are pretty close in brightness to the brightest one. So there's a big gulf between the modern handhelds and the old ones, with, I guess, the exception of the ROG 28XX, which puts in a kind of poor showing for modern handhelds. It's actually a lot closer to the 10 and 20-year-old ones. But you can see that a lot of the modern handhelds cluster in around the same area. So, we get pretty acceptable brightness from most of our modern handhelds, although some are brighter than others. I thought, though, that probably the Best way to compare all these is just let's base our results on something kind of more in the middle, the Odin 2 here. So you can see that the RG 556 would be significantly brighter than the Odin 2, and the Retroid is somewhat brighter as well. Again, I wouldn't take very, very small differences in these numbers to mean a whole lot, because the meter here is not the $300 to $1,000 meter that you might want to use to do a better test. But we can certainly see some information here. Now, what I'm curious about is, it's not out yet, or at least it's not out to us mere mortals, the Odin 2 Mini, which is supposed to have a super bright screen. I hope to be able to get one of those and put it on the same tests, and when I do, I'll update the video a bit so we can see if the Odin 2 Mini screen really lives up to the hype. But for now, it looks like, at least of the retro handhelds that I have, if you're just looking for sheer screen brightness, the RG 556 is definitely the king. So, I hope you've enjoyed taking a look at some numbers, talking about screen brightness rather than just trying to visualize things off of looking at people's YouTube videos and looking at how bright the handheld appears on camera. So we've got some objective, if not perfect, if certainly not perfect numbers. If you enjoyed the video, certainly leave a like. If you want to see more content here on the Chemical Burrito channel, subscribe. I try to post things every now and then. And if you have any comments about methodology, about handhelds in general, about screen brightness, please leave a comment. I generally read all the comments and try to reply to them all, which is easy since I'm a small channel, but we still do try to keep up the lines of communication around here. So hope you enjoyed the video, and hopefully I will see you around for the next one.